Imagine, for a second, that you decide to move to a new city.
Right.
You pack up your entire life, you find a new apartment, you put on the pair of jeans, and you head out to start your day.
Sounds pretty normal so far.
Yeah, exactly. But then when you go to register for healthcare, or maybe you try to go vote, the local government official look at your jeans, look at your urban address, and says, well, actually, because of what you're wearing and where you live, your ethnic identity, your history, and your legal rights have just evaporated. You no longer exist to us.
Wow. I mean, it sounds like the premise of a dystopian novel, right? Like a glitch in some massive bureaucratic matrix.
Yeah, it really does.
But for the people we're talking about today, it isn't fiction at all. It is a lived, incredibly dangerous reality.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to explore a really dense but deeply fascinating academic chapter by J.P. Linstroth. It's titled Brazilian Nationalism and Urban Amerindians.
It's a heavy one, but so important.
Oh, absolutely. We are looking at the clash between indigenous identity and national identity in Brazil. We're going to see how a government can literally try to erase a people through the concept of a mixed-race utopia, and, crucially, how those people fight back by hacking the very system trying to erase them.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even begin to understand a dynamic where moving to a city erases your legal existence?
Well, I think we have to start by establishing the broader context of what indigenous populations are actually asking for when they organize politically, because it fundamentally changes how the state views them.
That makes sense.
Usually, like, when we think of nationalist movements, we think of ethno-nationalists, groups who want us to see, draw a new border and form their own independent country.
And breaking away completely.
Exactly. But indigenous populations, however, typically want something entirely different. They usually want autonomy, land recognition, and basic human rights within the existing state architecture. So they aren't trying to tear up the map. They're basically saying, we are here, inside your borders, we predate those borders, and we want our rights recognized.
Yeah, and paradoxically, that makes the state view them as a massive existential threat.
Wait, really? Why a threat if they aren't trying to leave?
Because if a government acknowledges an indigenous group's inherent rights to the land and to self-determination, that government is forced to question its own absolute authority. It has to look in the mirror and acknowledge how it acquired that land in the first place.
Oh, I see. It shines a glaring spotlight on the state's historical legitimacy. Or, well, lack thereof.
Exactly. So to understand the modern struggles of Brazil's indigenous people, especially those living in major urban centers like Manaus, we first have to understand the historical machinery that was designed to make them disappear.
Make them disappear physically.
Not just through physical violence, but through a highly calculated administrative vanishing act.
Right. And the source material traces this back to a concept from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the idea of mestiçagem. This vision of a multicultural, mixed-race Brazilian society forging a singular raça brasileira.
Yeah, the Brazilian race.
On the surface, I mean, to a modern listener, that might sound like a beautiful post-racial utopia, a melting pot where everyone is equal.
On paper, sure, it sounds incredibly progressive, but in practice, it was a highly effective political tool for erasure.
How so?
Well, the ultimate goal of this melting pot was to absorb indigenous and Afro-Brazilian identities, just completely folding them into a single homogenized national identity that was heavily tilted toward European ideals. It wasn't about celebrating differences, it was about dissolving them.
And the mechanism driving this dissolution was something called French positivism, which I know had a massive influence on the Brazilian Republic. I mean, that national flag literally says, Ordem e progresso, order and progress.
Yep, it's right there in green and yellow.
But how does a philosophical love for order and progress translate into erasing indigenous communities?
So positivism, originally developed by Auguste Comte, viewed human society as evolving in strict, inevitable stages. You start at a fetishistic or primitive stage, you move up to a theological or polytheistic stage, and you finally culminate in the scientific industrial stage.
Okay, so it was the latter.
Right. And if your entire national philosophy is built on the worship of scientific progress and industrial order, anything ancient or traditional is inherently viewed as disorderly. It's an obstacle.
So an uncontacted tribe living in the Amazon isn't seen as a separate culture with its own rights. They're seen as evolutionary stragglers holding back the industrial destiny of the nation.
That was exactly the prevailing mindset. And this ideology was institutionalized in 1910 when a man named Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon founded the Indian Protection Service, or the SPI.
Oh, Rondon.
Rondon is a fascinating historical figure because he was of indigenous descent himself, yet he was a devout positivist. His famous motto for dealing with uncontacted tribes was, "Die if you must, but never kill."
See, I have to push back on Rondon's legacy here. Die if you must, but never kill. Sounds like a pacifist manifesto. It sounds noble. But when you look at the actual policies the SPI implemented, treating these people as infant wards of the state who needed to be elevated into the industrial age, isn't that just forced assimilation wrapped in a bow of benevolent paternalism?
What's fascinating here is how that exact tension played out on the ground. The peaceful pacification was entirely conditional.
Conditional how?
The SBI's goal was to use gifts, machetes, mirrors, manufactured clothes to attract indigenous groups, and then systematically transform them into national workers. The state wanted agricultural laborers and cattle herders. They wanted them contributing to the capitalist economy.
And if they didn't want to be cattle herders?
They didn't have a choice. Legally, this was codified in the 1916 Civil Code, which declared indigenous people relatively incapable. It created a system called tutela, meaning wardship. Indigenous people were made literal wards of the state.
Wow. Let's break down what that actually means for a person's day-to-day life. Being a ward of the state means you are legally treated as a minor.
Yes. You couldn't sign a binding contract. You couldn't open a bank account independently.
Seriously?
Seriously, you couldn't freely travel or make major life decisions without the oversight and permission of a government agent. The state assumed total control over your personhood under the guise of protecting you until you were deemed civilized enough to join the workforce.
And the fallout from this supposedly benevolent pacification was catastrophic, right? You can't just mandate someone into the industrial age without massive friction.
Oh, absolutely. The reality of contact was devastating. The introduction of outsiders brought rampant diseases, which decimated populations who had no immunity. And the state couldn't simply wait for these populations to slowly assimilate because by the 1970s, Brazil was pushing aggressively to modernize. The government began bulldozing massive highways straight through the Amazon, promoting large-scale mining operations and subsidizing massive agribusinesses.
Which physically pushed these communities out of the jungle. I mean, if a highway is literally paving over your ancestral land and the state legally views you as a child who can't fight back in court, you are going to be violently displaced.
Precisely. The state's relentless push for integration and economic extraction led to the ethnocide of numerous groups. Their land was seized, their way of life was made impossible, and out of sheer survival, many indigenous people inevitably began migrating toward urban centers.
Looking for a way out.
Right, they moved to places like the city of Manaus, seeking work, seeking healthcare, basically seeking survival.
But arriving in the city triggered an entirely new legal showdown. And this is where the sheer logistical nightmare of fighting the state comes into play. You have dozens of disparate indigenous groups, some of whom may have historically been rivals, suddenly finding themselves marginalized in the same urban favelas.
Yeah, and this pressure cooker environment in the 1970s and 80s sparked the rise of pan-indigenous movements across Latin America. It's a monumental organizational feat, if you think about it.
Oh, I bet.
You have tribes with entirely different languages, different cosmologies, and different cultural practices realizing they have to sit in a room together and form a unified political front. They had to realize that the bureaucracy in the capital was their common enemy.
And that unified front actually achieved something miraculous, didn't it? Yeah. The organizing pressure in Brazil culminated in the 1988 Constitution, which was a massive watershed moment. On paper, it finally recognized indigenous rights to their original lands, to their customs, and to their languages. It officially ended that patronizing era of wardship we just talked about.
It was a monumental legal victory, for sure, but the state is stubborn, and bureaucracies are incredibly adept at finding loopholes.
As they always do.
Always. The government found a new way to marginalize these communities, specifically targeting those who had been forced into the cities. And this brings us to the profound paradox of the urban Indian.
Right. When indigenous people, the text specifically mentions groups like the Sateré-Malway or the Kokama, moved to Manaus, the government agencies, particularly FUNAI, which replaced the old SPI, looked at them and applied a new administrative label, civilizados.
Civilized.
Right. And by labeling an urban indigenous person civilized, the state was executing a very sharp legal maneuver.
How so?
They argued that because you live in a city, because you speak Portuguese, because you participate in the wage economy, you have effectively lost your Indianness. And if you aren't an Indian anymore, well, The state argues it no longer owes you the specific health care, the land rights, or the protections that were promised in that hard-fought 1988 Constitution. That is wow. It's like a massive bureaucratic catch-22. It's like being invited to play a game of chess, but the moment your pawn battles its way across the entire board to become a queen, the referee taps your shoulder and says you're disqualified for upgrading.
That's a great way to put it.
The state spends a century forcing you to assimilate, taking your land, pushing you into the working class. But the second you do, the second you wear jeans and live in an apartment in Manaus, they say, aha, you're not indigenous anymore, so we don't owe you anything.
That captures the trap perfectly. It stems from a deeply ingrained Western fantasy that anthropologists call the hyper-real Indian.
The hyper-real Indian.
Yeah, it's this romanticized, static image that an indigenous person is only authentic if they are a pristine, naked warrior living in harmonic stasis in the deep jungle, completely untouched by time. If you have a cell phone, if you drive a car, if you live in a concrete house, white society decides you are no longer real.
Which is an absurd standard we don't apply to anyone else. I mean, if someone moves from Tokyo to London, they don't stop being Japanese just because they took the tube and bought a coffee. Their heritage doesn't evaporate because they interacted with modernity.
Exactly. And this raises an important question. How do indigenous people possibly fight back against a state that uses their very survival tactics as an excuse to legally erase them when your identity is being weaponized to deny you resources?
And the stakes for those resources were absolute life and death. This bureaucratic erasure wasn't just an insult to their heritage, it was lethal.
Absolutely lethal.
By classifying urban Indians as civilized, agencies like FUNASA, the National Health Foundation, were basically washing their hands of them. Urban Indians were being cut off from vital healthcare networks and were dying in the cities of completely preventable diseases.
Yeah.
Malaria, hepatitis, severe malnutrition.
Just tragic.
It really is. And this utter desperation is what leads us to the breaking point in June 2009.
Right, the Funasa siege. This is a defining watershed moment for urban indigenous politics in Brazil. In June of 2009, over 300 urban Amerindians in Manaus physically occupied the Funasa compound.
Over 300 people.
Yes. And we need to emphasize the scale of this. They didn't just protest outside with signs for an afternoon. They locked down a federal compound for 16 days.
16 days of intense psychological and physical standoff. Over 300 people taking over federal buildings because FUNASA was plagued by gross mismanagement, alleged corruption, and was flat out ignoring the urban indigenous population dying on its doorstep.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting. It's not just the sheer endurance of a 2-week occupation, it's the brilliant psychology of how they protested.
Oh, the strategy was a masterclass in political theater and media manipulation.
Walk us through it.
So the author notes that these urban Indians who, remember, live in the city, wear modern clothes, have everyday jobs, strategically painted themselves with traditional body paint for the occupation. They arm themselves with bows, blowpipes, heavy clubs, and spears. They set up a hard perimeter around the compound and declared to the authorities that they were ready for a big war.
They don't walk around downtown Manaus carrying bows and blowpipes on a Tuesday. They knew exactly what they were doing.
Exactly.
They took the state's rigid, absurd stereotype and weaponized it. The state said, we only recognize the hyper-real Indian, the warrior from the jungle. So the protesters essentially put on the costume the state demanded in order to hack the system, get their health care.
They understood that the media and the government would only pay attention if they provided the visual of the authentic Indian. They used the state's own narrow definition of indigenous identity to force white society to look at them. And the tension during those 16 days must have been incredible.
Unimaginable.
You have federal authorities trying to figure out how to handle hundreds of people who are projecting this fearsome traditional warrior image while simultaneously negotiating complex health district policy.
Is hacking the bureaucracy through sheer performance. And the most incredible part is that it worked. They broke the catch-22.
They did. The occupation forced the highest levels of government to the negotiating table. It resulted in a presidential decree, Decree number 6.878, which granted autonomy to indigenous health districts.
That's huge.
And even more tangibly, it forced the government to allocate approximately 100 million reais, which was about 41 million US dollars at the time, specifically dedicated to indigenous health infrastructure.
Wow. They secured $41 million and saved countless lives by refusing to be invisible. But as triumphant as that victory was, our sources point out that it also exposes a much darker underlying current. The fact that citizens had to go to such extreme lengths, literally threatening war with bows and arrows just to get basic health care, reveals the violent, invisible histories still operating beneath the surface.
There's a philosophical concept that perfectly captures what these protests are doing. Michel Foucault called it the insurrection of subjugated knowledges.
Subjugated knowledges. Let's ground that concept. What does that look like in practice?
Think of it as the buried realities of a nation. The state writes the official history, the shiny narrative of progress, of a unified mixed-race nation of benevolent protection through agencies like the SPI.
The order and progress narrative.
Exactly. But beneath that official sanitized narrative are the historical realities that have been intentionally disguised or erased. The enslavement, the massacres, the forced relocations, the daily discrimination.
Right.
The insurrection happens when the marginalized people rise up and force those buried truths into the light. The Funasa siege was an insurrection of subjugated knowledge. They were standing in the capital of the Amazon saying, "We are still here, we are dying, and your history of peaceful assimilation is a lie."
And this clash isn't confined to history books or philosophical debates. The violence required to maintain that official history is an everyday reality. The source material shares a really harrowing story from 2008 about a woman named Ileana.
Yes.
She was an urban Sadere Mowe woman, and she was pregnant.
The incident occurred when police were brought in to remove Indigenous people who were squatting on a piece of land in the city. The brutality of the eviction was severe.
Ileana described how the police started aggressively pushing her, completely disregarding the fact that she was pregnant and holding her other baby. She watched them choke her husband.
Horrific.
But the most chilling detail, the part that ties this whole deeply flawed system together, is what the police yelled at them while they were administering this beating. They yelled, "You are not an Indian, you are civilized," and that people, meaning Indians, were invaders.
That single sentence perfectly encapsulates the politics of trauma. They used the state's administrative label civilized as the explicit justification for physical violence.
It's so twisted.
It is. The state defines you out of existence, strips you of your protections, and then uses that very definition to beat you and evict you from your home.
And this violence extends far beyond urban evictions in Manaus. The source material details broader, ongoing conflicts over resources that look terrifyingly similar to the frontier violence of the past. For instance, the text examines the Munduruku people's intense fight against massive hydroelectric dams planned for their lands around 2012.
Yeah, the scale of these infrastructure projects is massive, and the resistance to them is met with overwhelming force. The source material details some severe allegations regarding these conflicts over illegal gold mining and dam construction.
What kind of allegations?
The text notes claims that during efforts to suppress the Munduruku resistance, the Brazilian military utilized heavily armed forces, with allegations that a military helicopter actually fired on indigenous people.
Wow. We should note that's a claim from the source text, but it illustrates a stark, undeniable point. State power is still being wielded, often with devastating violence, whenever indigenous bodies stand in the way of national economic resources. The progress part of order and progress still demands a heavy toll.
Absolutely. The conflict is not an artifact of the past. It is an ongoing daily negotiation for physical and cultural survival against a state apparatus that fundamentally views indigenous existence and indigenous land claims as an obstacle to national development.
You know, if you live in London or New York or Sydney, it's easy to listen to this and think of it as a distant, isolated conflict in the Amazon. But look closely at your own city's zoning laws. Look at the historical markers in your local parks, or rather the lack of them. Why should you care about this? Because this isn't just a history lesson about Brazil. This is a profound look at how any society constructs its truth.
Completely agree.
It forces you to look at your own borders and ask, who had to be erased for our national identity to exist? Who was labeled uncivilized to justify taking their wealth? And who is still fighting right now just to be seen by the legal system. Every nation-state has its subjugated knowledges. Every nation has invisible histories buried under its highways and high-rises.
So what does this all mean? We've journeyed from the 19th century positivist myth of a mixed-race utopia, a system meticulously designed to absorb and erase indigenous culture in the name of progress. We examined the crushing day-to-day reality of the wardship system and saw how being pushed into the city created the rigged chess game of the urban Indian, where assimilation meant losing your constitutional rights.
Right.
We watched as 300 people brilliantly weaponize the state's own hyperreal stereotypes during the 16-day Fanassa siege to win back their health care. And we've confronted the dark, invisible histories of violence that are still used to enforce these bureaucratic labels today. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the most vital takeaway from Lindstroth's work is that Indigenous identity is not some fragile, static relic of the past waiting to quietly fade away in a museum diorama.
Right. It's alive.
Exactly. It is a highly dynamic, incredibly modern political tool. These communities are adapting to the cities. They are organizing across language barriers, utilizing international media networks, and deploying strategic performances of identity to survive against state-sponsored erasure. They are not passive victims of history. They are active, strategic agents fighting fiercely for their future.
That adaptability is incredible to witness, and it brings up one final, really provocative thought from the source material that I want to leave you with. Towards the very end of the chapter, the author briefly mentions the growing battle over traditional resource rights and intellectual property rights.
Oh, this is a huge issue.
Yeah, for centuries, indigenous knowledge like deep ethnobotanical medicine, knowing exactly which jungle plants heal which diseases, was dismissed by the state as savage, fetishistic, or backward.
The state wanted nothing to do with it, viewing it as the complete opposite of scientific progress.
Exactly. But today, that narrative has violently flipped. Now, massive multinational pharmaceutical companies and modern governments realize there are billions of dollars locked inside that ancient knowledge. Suddenly, they are intensely interested in patenting, commodifying, and mass-producing indigenous medicine.
It's basically biopiracy.
It is. So I want you to think about that. How long until the very states that spent a century trying to erase indigenous people, denying their rights because they wore jeans and lived in cities, how long until those same states start aggressively claiming indigenous knowledge as their own national intellectual property to sell to the world?
It is the ultimate cynical irony of assimilation. Discard the people, erase their legal rights, but patent their wisdom for profit.
It really makes you look differently at the systems, the labels, and the medications around us. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Next time you put on a pair of jeans and walk out into your city, remember the immense power of the administrative label society places on you and the incredible, enduring power you have to push back. Take care, everyone.